August 14th, 1943. 1830 hours. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Giuseppe Marino sat on the wooden steps of his barracks, watching the sun settle toward the Alabama horizon, painting the camp's guard towers in shades of orange that reminded him painfully of sunset over Naples Harbor. He'd been a prisoner for 11 weeks, captured during the Sicily campaign, processed through transit camps in North Africa and England, transported across the Atlantic on a Liberty ship that took 17 days to reach New York, and finally delivered by train to this cotton field turned internment facility that held 4,000 Italian soldiers who'd expected American captivity to mean something entirely different than what they'd experienced. The camp looked nothing like prison. The barracks were newly constructed wood frame buildings with real mattresses and mosquito netting. The dining hall served 3 meals daily. Plain food by Italian standards, but abundant beyond anything Giuseppe had eaten during 2 years of military service in North Africa, where supply lines had been unreliable and rations had been perpetually inadequate. The guards carried rifles, but maintained casual demeanor that suggested they viewed prisoners as logistical problem rather than dangerous enemies. But what confused Giuseppe most was the sound drifting from the camp administration building, someone singing in Italian. Not a prisoner singing to himself, but amplified voice coming through speakers that carried across the entire compound. The song was O Sole Mio, rendered in Neapolitan dialect that Giuseppe recognized from his childhood in the narrow streets, climbing up from the harbor where laundry hung between buildings and women called to each other from windows. He walked toward the administration building, drawn by familiar music in unfamiliar context. Other prisoners were gathering too, moving toward the sound with expressions mixing confusion and longing. The song ended. Then another voice spoke in Italian, accented but comprehensible, inviting prisoners to the recreation yard for what was being described as a musical program organized by Italian-American community members from nearby Tuscaloosa. Giuseppe had heard that significant numbers of Italian immigrants lived in America. He'd met an American soldier from Brooklyn during transport who'd tried to communicate in broken Italian and mentioned that his grandparents had emigrated from Calabria in 1902. But the concept of Italian Americans organizing entertainment for Italian prisoners seemed bizarre to the point of impossible. Why would Americans of Italian descent want anything to do with soldiers who'd fought for Mussolini and Hitler? The arithmetic of captivity. The United States held approximately 51,000 Italian prisoners of war by late 1943, the majority captured during North African campaigns that had culminated in Axis surrender in Tunisia during May. The number would eventually exceed 50,000, as additional prisoners were taken during the Italian campaign that began in July, and would continue for nearly 2 years as Allied forces pushed slowly northward through mountainous terrain where German forces conducted masterful defensive operations. Camp Aliceville, located in rural Alabama, approximately 40 miles southwest of Tuscaloosa, was one of the larger facilities constructed specifically for Italian prisoners. The camp occupied 600 acres of former agricultural land, contained 4 prisoner compounds that could house 6,000 men, and employed American military personnel who were generally selected for assignments considered relatively comfortable compared to combat service or training for eventual deployment overseas. Tuscaloosa County alone included approximately 1,200 residents of Italian descent by 1943, first, second, and third generation Americans who maintained cultural connections to their ancestral homeland while being thoroughly integrated into Southern life. Many were bilingual, speaking English in public and business contexts while using Italian or regional dialects at home. They followed news from Italy with intense interest and complex emotions, supporting America's war effort while mourning the country their families had left decades earlier. The first tentative contacts. The camp commander, Colonel William Bradford, had served in Italy during World War I and spoke functional Italian learned during 8 months in northern Italy during 1918. He recognized quickly that the Italian prisoners under his command weren't ideologically committed fascists, but conscripts who'd served because Italian law required military service and because refusing meant imprisonment or worse. Most were peasants and working-class men from southern Italy who'd cared more about survival than politics, who'd surrendered willingly when circumstances made continued fighting pointless, and who'd been visibly relieved to become American prisoners rather than casualties. Bradford understood that managing 4,000 men who had nothing to do except sit in barracks would create discipline problems and low morale that would make his job more difficult. The solution was keeping prisoners occupied with work programs, recreational activities, and community connections that provided purpose beyond simply waiting for the war to end and repatriation to become possible. He'd approved visits from local religious leaders who wanted to conduct Catholic services in Italian for prisoners who'd had limited access to religious practices during their military service. The services attracted hundreds of prisoners who valued connection to familiar ritual and opportunity to hear Italian spoken by someone other than fellow captives. The priests mentioned these visits to their congregations, creating awareness among Italian-American parishioners that Italian prisoners were being held nearby. Maria Rossi, a second-generation Italian-American from Tuscaloosa, whose parents had emigrated from Sicily in 1905, attended one of these church meetings where Father Antonio Benedetto described his visits to Camp Aliceville. She'd been raised speaking Sicilian dialect at home, had married into another Italian immigrant family, and maintained strong cultural identity despite being thoroughly American in education, employment, and political loyalty. After the meeting, she approached Father Benedetto with a question that would initiate one of the war's more unusual humanitarian efforts. Could Italian-American families visit the camp to provide support and connection to prisoners who were far from home? The priest wasn't sure. He'd only been authorized to conduct religious services, not facilitate general community visits. But he promised to ask Colonel Bradford whether such visits would be permitted. Bradford's response was cautiously positive. Visits would be allowed under supervision, restricted to recreational areas rather than barracks, and subject to regulations that prohibited providing information useful for escape or creating security concerns. But within those limitations, he welcomed community involvement that would improve prisoner morale and potentially reduce the isolation that made camp life psychologically difficult. The first community visit occurred on a Saturday afternoon in late July 1943. 15 Italian-American families arrived at the camp bearing homemade food, bread, pastries, preserved vegetables, and wine that violated camp regulations, but that Bradford chose to overlook because the symbolic value exceeded the technical violation. The families set up tables in the recreation yard while several hundred prisoners watched from distance, uncertain whether this was some elaborate trick or genuine gesture of hospitality. Maria Rossi stood near one table and called out in Sicilian dialect, asking if anyone was from Sicily. 3 prisoners approached hesitantly. She asked which towns they were from. One was from Palermo, another from a village near Catania, the third from the same region her parents had left nearly 40 years earlier. She began asking about specific families she'd heard her parents mention, discovering that one prisoner knew cousins of relatives she'd never met, but had heard stories about her entire life. Giuseppe Marino found himself talking with a man named Anthony Castellano, whose father had emigrated from Naples in 1898. Castellano spoke Neapolitan dialect that Giuseppe had heard his entire life, making conversation feel like talking to someone from his own neighborhood, despite the fact that Castellano was thoroughly American. Born in Alabama, educated in American schools, employed as a construction supervisor for a company building military facilities, Castellano asked about Naples, wanting to know if specific streets and churches he'd heard his father describe still existed. Giuseppe confirmed that most did, though the city had changed substantially during 2 decades of fascist rule. They talked about food, about neighborhoods, about the harbor, and the way sunset looked from the hills above the city. The conversation was simultaneously profound connection to shared heritage and painful reminder that Giuseppe was prisoner who might not see Naples again for years. The music that transcended status. The community visits became weekly events through August and early September, with growing numbers of Italian-American families making the 40-mile drive from Tuscaloosa to spend Saturday afternoons at Camp Aliceville. The gatherings evolved beyond simple visiting into cultural celebrations that included food, conversation, and increasingly music that became the visit's defining characteristic. Several prisoners had been professional or semi-professional musicians before the war. Giuseppe had played guitar in a small band that performed at restaurants and festivals around Naples. Another prisoner, Marco Bianchi from Florence, had studied classical violin before being drafted. A third, Pietro Romano from Rome, sang professionally at weddings and celebrations. The presence of accomplished musicians among the prisoners created opportunity for performances that had entertainment value but also deeper significance as expressions of cultural identity that transcended the circumstances, bringing everyone together. The Italian-American visitors recognized this immediately. Several brought instruments, guitars, mandolins, accordions that were common in Italian immigrant households and that had been carefully maintained across decades as connections to musical traditions that defined Italian cultural life. The instruments were offered to prisoners who took them with visible emotion, holding familiar shapes that represented home in ways more powerful than any conversation could achieve. The first impromptu concert happened spontaneously rather than through formal planning. Giuseppe was holding a borrowed guitar, tuning it carefully, when someone in the crowd of visitors called out a request for Santa Lucia, a Neapolitan song that was famous throughout Italy and well known among Italian immigrants in America. Giuseppe began playing without consciously deciding to perform, the muscle memory of the song's chord progression taking over before his mind could catch up to what he was doing. He sang the first verse alone, his voice carrying across the recreation yard where several hundred prisoners and perhaps 50 American visitors had gathered. Then voices joined him. Prisoners who knew the song from childhood, Italian-American visitors who'd learned it from parents and grandparents, even some American guards who'd picked up the melody from repeated exposure during community visits. The combined chorus created a moment of cultural unity that transcended every category that supposedly separated people gathered in the yard. Giuseppe finished the song to applause and immediately calls for more. He played O Sole Mio, Torna a Sorrento, Funiculi Funicula, the repertoire of Neapolitan popular music that had spread globally wherever Italian immigrants had settled. Other musicians joined him, creating ensemble that improvised harmonies and arrangements based on shared knowledge of musical traditions that all participants understood instinctively. Colonel Bradford watched from his office window, recognizing that something significant was happening beyond simple entertainment. The music was creating community that dissolved the boundary between captors and captives, creating shared identity based on cultural heritage that proved more powerful than political circumstances. The transformation was visible in body language and expressions. Prisoners who typically maintained guarded demeanor were smiling, laughing, fully engaged in ways that weeks of recreational programming hadn't achieved. The concert that changed everything. The success of informal musical performances led to more ambitious planning. Maria Rossi and other members of the Italian-American community approached Colonel Bradford with proposal to organize formal concert featuring prisoner musicians performing for mixed audience of prisoners, American military personnel, and civilian guests. The proposal included inviting additional Italian-American families from throughout the region, potentially drawing several hundred people to what would essentially be cultural celebration at POW camp. Bradford recognized immediately that the proposal would create administrative complications and potential criticism from those who might object to treating enemy prisoners like honored guests. But he also understood that the concert would serve multiple purposes, demonstrating to prisoners that America valued cultural expression, showing Italian-American community that their heritage was respected, and creating positive morale among both prisoners and American personnel who would benefit from entertainment that broke monotony of camp routine. He approved the concert with conditions that maintained security protocols and emphasized that this was cultural exchange rather than political statement. The date was set for Saturday evening, August 14, 1943. The venue would be the recreation yard with makeshift stage constructed from lumber available on base. Attendance would be limited to approved visitors who'd undergone circumstances created by war that had separated people who shared fundamental cultural connections. The curtain opened. Giuseppe walked onto stage with his guitar, followed by Marco with violin, Pietro the singer, and 3 other musicians who had been assembled into ensemble representing multiple Italian regions and musical traditions. The audience applauded, prisoners enthusiastically, civilians warmly, American military personnel politely. Everyone understood that this was more than entertainment. It was statement about what was possible even in circumstances defined by military conflict and legal categories that classified people as enemies or allies. The first song was Tarantella Napoletana, chosen deliberately as upbeat celebration that would establish joyful tone rather than melancholy that could have been equally justified given that everyone present was in some way affected by war's disruptions. Giuseppe played the opening measures, the rapid rhythm immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with Southern Italian musical traditions. The other musicians joined in, creating arrangement that built from simple melody to complex harmonies that showcased individual talents, while maintaining cohesive ensemble sound. The audience responded immediately. Prisoners began clapping in rhythm. Italian-American civilians joined them. American military personnel, perhaps uncomfortable with showing too much enthusiasm for prisoner performance, nevertheless nodded along with the music. The sound filled the recreation yard, rising above the camp's barbed wire perimeter into Alabama darkness, where it could probably be heard by farmers in surrounding countryside who might have wondered what strange celebration was happening at the POW camp. The ensemble performed 6 songs before the moment that would define the entire evening. Pietro announced in Italian and English that they would perform O Sole Mio, perhaps the most famous Neapolitan song known throughout the world, representing Italian musical culture at its most accessible and emotionally powerful. Giuseppe began the opening chord progression, familiar to the point of cliché, but still effective in creating anticipation for melody that millions of people could recognize after hearing just the first notes. Pietro sang the opening verse in clear tenor that demonstrated years of professional training. The song's lyrics described sunshine and love with romantic sentimentality that was quintessentially Italian, emotional directness that Anglo-Saxon culture often found excessive, but that Italian tradition embraced as authentic expression of human feeling. Pietro's delivery balanced technical precision with genuine emotion, creating performance that was simultaneously professional and deeply personal. Halfway through the second verse, voices from the audience joined in. First, a few prisoners who couldn't resist singing along with a song they'd known since childhood. Then, Italian-American civilians, adding harmonies they'd learned from their parents and grandparents. Then, unexpectedly, several American soldiers of Italian descent who'd been standing at the edges of the audience moved forward and began singing, their voices carrying across the recreation yard in ways that transformed the performance from stage presentation to collective celebration. Giuseppe continued playing, adjusting his accompaniment to support the expanded chorus that now included dozens of voices blending in impromptu harmonies that no one had planned, but everyone understood intuitively. Marco's violin wove melodic lines on background checks, with American military personnel providing security presence that remained deliberately low-key. The 2 weeks before the concert became a period of intense preparation. Giuseppe and other prisoner musicians rehearsed daily, working out arrangements for songs that would showcase Italian musical traditions while remaining accessible to audience members who might not share deep familiarity with regional folk music. They selected repertoire spanning centuries and regions, Neapolitan love songs, Sicilian ballads, Roman theatrical pieces, Northern Italian folk melodies, and popular music from the 1920s and 1930s that represented Italy's last period of relative prosperity before fascism and war consumed everything. The Italian-American community organized logistics for bringing instruments, sound equipment, and refreshments that would transform the evening into genuine celebration rather than simple performance. Multiple families coordinated contributions, creating collective effort that engaged much of Tuscaloosa's Italian population in supporting projects that connected them to their heritage while demonstrating American values about cultural respect and human dignity. The evening of August 14th was Alabama, summer heat barely diminished by sunset. Humidity thick enough that simply sitting still produced sweat. The recreation yard filled with approximately 800 people, 4,000 prisoners authorized to attend, 200 Italian-American civilians who'd traveled from throughout the region, and 100 American military personnel who were on duty or attending voluntarily. The stage was simple, a wooden platform 15 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with American flag displayed prominently alongside Italian flag that Bradford had ordered specifically for the occasion, despite questions about protocol involved in displaying the flag of a country that had until recently been America's enemy. The dual flags represented the complicated status of Italian prisoners who were simultaneously former enemies, current workers, and fellow human beings whose cultural identity deserved acknowledgement. The performance that dissolved boundaries. Giuseppe stood backstage, really just behind a canvas curtain that created minimal separation from audience, listening to Colonel Bradford deliver opening remarks in English and Italian that welcomed everyone to an evening celebrating Italian musical heritage. The introduction was brief and matter-of-fact, avoiding excessive sentiment while acknowledging that bringing together Italian prisoners and Italian-American civilians represented unusual above the voices. The other instrumentalists provided rhythmic foundation, and Pietro led the ensemble through remaining verses while tears visible on his face reflected emotion shared by many people gathered in the recreation yard. The song concluded to applause that lasted more than a minute, with prisoners and civilians standing, American military personnel joining them, and Colonel Bradford watching from the side with expression suggesting he recognized significance of moment that transcended the categories of prisoner and guard, enemy and ally, Italian and American. The conversations that continued. After music ended, the concert continued for another hour, with additional performances that ranged from solemn religious songs to comic theatrical pieces that required no translation to communicate their humor. But the defining moment had already occurred during O Sole Mio, when the boundary between performer and audience had dissolved into shared cultural expression that demonstrated truths about human connection that war attempted to deny but couldn't completely destroy. After the final song, Colonel Bradford invited prisoners and civilian visitors to mix informally while refreshments were served. The deliberate violation of typical separation protocols created opportunity for extended conversations that went beyond the brief exchanges possible during daytime visits. Prisoners and Italian-American civilians talked for hours, discovering connections to specific towns and regions, sharing information about family members who might still be in Italy, discussing how war had affected communities on both sides of the Atlantic. Giuseppe found himself in extended conversation with Anthony Castellano and Maria Rossi, describing life in Naples before and during the war, answering questions about whether specific neighborhoods still existed and what had happened to communities that both visitors had heard about through family stories but had never personally visited. The conversation was simultaneously tour of shared heritage and documentation of how much had changed during decades that separated Italian-American immigrants' departure from contemporary reality in Italy under fascism and war. Maria asked Giuseppe what he planned to do after the war ended, and he was repatriated. Giuseppe admitted he didn't know. Naples had been badly damaged by Allied bombing, his family's small restaurant had been closed since 1941, and he had no clear idea what opportunities would exist in post-war Italy. Maria suggested quietly that he might consider returning to America after repatriation, not as prisoner, but as immigrant, seeking opportunities that Italy might not be able to provide after years of devastation. The suggestion seemed impossible. Giuseppe was prisoner of war, enemy combatant, someone who'd fought against the country that now held him. The idea that he might someday immigrate to America seemed like fantasy, divorced from any realistic assessment of how international relations and immigration policy worked. But Maria was serious. Many Italian prisoners would stay in America after the war, she predicted. The connection between Italian-American communities and Italian prisoners was creating relationships that would persist beyond military conflict and legal classifications. Giuseppe arrived in New York in March 1952, traveled by train to Alabama, and was met at the station by the Castellano family, who'd maintained correspondence with him for 9 years, despite having no obligation beyond human connection created during wartime concerts at prison camp. He moved into a boarding house in Tuscaloosa, found work as a carpenter with construction company that was building suburban homes for families benefiting from post-war prosperity, and began process of becoming American while maintaining Italian identity that had first connected him to people who'd helped him survive imprisonment with dignity intact.